Hello, my friends. John LaRuffa here with a new episode or a new series, I should say. I'm going to try to make, and I'm going to call it Musings on Mechanics. We'll talk about some board game mechanics that I really like, or ones that we see in the industry, and always I try to focus on the solo aspect, although I might reference games that aren't solo just for explanations or whatever. But the first one I want to talk to you about is one of my favorites, and that is worker placement. I've always been a big fan of worker placement games. And why is that? Well, because usually worker placement games have the way they're set up and the way that the mechanics work, they give you a lot of choices by default. There's usually a lots of different things you can do in any order that you want to do it. And it allows you to play games in a little bit more of a free form, sometimes sandbox way. But it also allows you to do some more choices. Like you might be able to choose to get things first before anybody else, or to take resources as they build up, which I'll talk about in a second, or maybe to pick something from an area majority standpoint to kind of get in while on that better level. And I think that's really fun. And I've always liked it. Now, the first worker placement game I ever played that I can identify is a non-solo game. This is way before I played solo, and this game was called Kalis. And if you guys have played Kalis, that game goes back to, I think, when I played it the first time, I think it was just getting its second edition printing in 2005. I think that was the second edition. Anyway, that game was a worker placement game that had some of the most penalizing and punitive mechanics I've ever seen. And I still actually will play that game for people who really like it from a nostalgia standpoint. But that is definitely not at this day and age, a favorite of mine from the worker placement side, because it overdoes what I like about worker placement. And the thing I like the most about worker placements when I have one that distinguishes it above the rest is the feeling of angst. It's the feeling of, I want to do this, but the longer I wait, the better it is. Or I want to do this, but I also want to do that, and I don't know which one I should pick, and what are other people going to pick, and am I going to get blocked? And I really like that. However, Kalis was so punitive that somebody could literally move this piece called the provost back so that all of your paid for actions would not even happen, and that was maddening. I mean, it was like it was a game that could bring people to tears of frustration. It was so frustrating. But that was the first one I played. Then, I mean, I guess I must have played some other ones that were similar, but one that really stuck out to me, the first one that I said, wow, this is an amazing, amazing game, was the worker placement game Agricola. Or Agricola. Pardon me. I think people will argue about that. Agricola. Okay. So Agricola is a game that uses worker placement in a very angsty way, but it isn't punitive, because when you put your worker down, you get what you get. All right. Now you might be blocked, you might be stopped, and you might also be incentivized to wait longer as the resources pile up, which is one of my ultimate favorite things about worker placement games, specifically by Uwe Rosenberg, is that a lot of his games, like Caverna, obviously Agricola, and I think Atiwa has a little bit of an element of this too, although I don't remember. I haven't played in a little while, so it's not nearly as pronounced as the other two. But the idea that resources build up from turn after turn, and when you take them, no, I don't think Atiwa has that. When you take those resources, then you get a bigger haul. It's a more powerful action than if you just take it every turn. And I really, really like that about that type of worker placement. And then it kind of evolved, right? You got more and more games. Now it seems like worker placement is in just about every game, not every game, but it's in a lot of games. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the worker placement mechanic will be like, oh, worker placement, I'm going to jump on it. Here's a great example of a worker placement game that I don't even care for the worker placement, but I still like the game. And I'll give you another example of Uwe Rosenberg, but Oranienburger Canal. I think the worker placement mechanism is actually kind of boring in that game because it's limited. And yeah, things sort of build up a little bit, but really that game's all about the interaction in the card play and trying to put things together in a very, very clever way to score a bunch of points. But I actually find the worker placement in that game pretty boring. And if it was just, I mean, because it's just so simplistic, it's got so few places to types of actions to take. You flip that on the other end, and my ultimate favorite worker placement is A Feast for Odin or Fields of Arle. I can't tell you which one because they're both awesome, but I love those games. And A Feast for Odin does not have a build-up mechanism, so to speak. But it's got like a super worker placement where, if I place one worker over here, I get a smaller action. 2 over here, it's a better. 3, it's even better. 4, it's a really, really strong action, but I sacrifice a bunch of my workers. And I think that's really kind of cool. Again, that one has like 55 different actions to play, so it's tons and tons of choices. So I love that. But, when you think about some games that are worker placement that don't really, that mechanic doesn't really get me that excited. There's a couple out there. Lost Ruins of Arnak, good game. I like playing it. It's an enjoyable game. But the actual worker placement element of that game, to me, is very minor compared to the rest of it. And so it's like, oh, okay. Maybe it's all right, but I like the rest of the part of it. The resource kind of gathering and the intricacies of trying to move up tracks and different things. I think that's more fun. And then there's games that have worker placement that I don't find very enjoyable. They tried to do different things with it. Sometimes they're okay games. They're not bad games. They just don't really excite me. Lords of Waterdeep is probably the first one that came to mind when I thought about worker placements that ultimately I soured on and I'm like, this game's kind of boring. For me. I know a lot of people love it. And that's not a solo game either, but I sold that one a long time ago because I just found like you place these workers and you did different things, but the gathering of resources was so kind of obvious and so basic in its contract fulfillment and stuff like that. It was just kind of a yawner. Another one that was maybe overwrought, maybe too much for me, or I just felt like it was more work and not as much fun was Golem. Golem. Golem had a lot going on besides, and I didn't feel the joy that I usually do when I played a game with that. And I parted with it. I've got an episode on why I let that one go. Even though that could be played solo, it just seemed like a lot of work. A couple other ones, the Manhattan Project and the Manhattan Project Energy Empire. For whatever reason, though, that was an example of specialized worker placement. Both of those games just did not stick out to me as enjoyable games I wanted to come back over and over. And those were an interesting one where it's like you place your workers, but then you have to retrieve your workers. And so I don't mind the mechanic. I think it's fine. It's just it didn't excite me. So I'm giving you these examples because I don't know. It's not worker placement by itself, even though it's one of my favorite mechanics, is not something that'll necessarily say this is going to be an awesome game. I can't wait to play it because it's worker placement. And now I'll list off a couple of really good ones I thought about besides the ones I've already mentioned. Asian Tigers is a very interesting. It's dry in the theme, but it's a really good worker placement game from a area majority game. Even at 2 players or a solo, it's really, really good. It's very tight. I think Paladins of the West Kingdom, really interesting game. Very, very mind-boggling in its choices. Great game to play solo. That's another specialized worker placement game. Really like it. Why do I like it? Well, because there's a ton of angst in that one. Again, goes back to the angst. Hadrian's Wall, that's more of a sandboxy kind. It's still specialized, but I love enjoying the Hadrian's Wall experience, trying different strategies, doing different things. Great experience. One that is really tight to score well, that I think does a good job, but doesn't have some of the things that I usually go with is Harvest. Harvest is a good worker placement game where you really could get blocked and you have so few turns and you have to really plan on the order of operations to do well. It's a very tight game from a resource standpoint to score well. So those are all good. Andromeda's Edge, great worker placement game. Really, really fun. Lots going on in that one. But that one's an interesting one in that you've got it's worker placement with a board mechanic that you can't place you have to be within range of your workers. So really cool ways to spin it. And then also you've got the variable power workers, and that's an interesting concept. So variable power. So the first one I think that did it was Euphoria, and you can get the Euphoria soul expansion, and basically that, the more powerful the worker, the better it was, and that was cool. But the one that didn't really strike for me in that regard, at least didn't really get me super excited, was Apiary. Apiary, for whatever reason, took the mechanic, but I think Apiary just came out about 10 years too late for me, because I'd already played bits and pieces of that style of game so much that it wasn't new enough, that it was just a bit of a retread. And then, everybody who's watched this channel knows how much I like the scholars, the wayfarers, and the inventors of the South Tigris. Those are all power-based worker placement, right? Because my dice are the workers, and the more powerful, the better the action, etc. So those are cool. But it's like I said, it's a weird mechanic, because I think it can be done really well, and I can really enjoy it, or I think it could be just too basic, and I think I could find it boring. Raiders of the North Sea, find that very boring. It feels like the same game over and over again. I sold it a long time ago. I have the app even on my iPad. Don't ever play it, because it just seems like it's the same thing. I'm just doing the same thing over and over. So an interesting mechanic for sure. One that I think is done really well as a solo, because you can always find good. So it seems like automas for that are not too tough. They block you. You can find good blocking mechanics in games like, the original automa, which is from viticulture, right? That's where the name came from, for pity's sake. That's a blocking mechanic. They also, it puts, you have to do different things and try to score different things, etc. to win. It's been a long time since I played that one solo. Played it a lot multiplayer, online, etc. But so those are my thoughts on worker placement. I'm going to try to do different mechanics in future episodes, but I'm interested to see what are some of your favorite worker placement games. What are games that are worker placement that you have played that you don't really care for? And I did not. This is not an exhaustive list. I try to just jump around here and there and pick up different things. The one of the other ones that's a strength-based worker placement that I didn't mention, that's standing right here, is of course Teotihuacan. Great game for worker placement, strengthening your workers, etc., and coupling them up. Really kind of an interesting rondel / worker placement game. Tons of fun. So anyway, that's what I've got. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I'm very interested to see and hear about what you think in the comments. So as I always say, thanks so much for watching. Whatever you do in the future, I really do hope you have a fantastic time doing it. Take it easy.